out. And today is the 127th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And this is where we critique a subject in order that by critiquing today, we get a better type of provision tomorrow. And the subject today is one that has emerged from previous webinars, don't they all in some way? And you will remember, if you've been joining us for each of the last 126, that we approach the issue from very, very different directions. So we've had offenders speaking about their side of the story and how they approach crime and believe they would have approached crime had they still been active during a pandemic. Today, we get a different perspective altogether. We're looking at the pandemic and crime rates, and we've got insights from 3 leading criminologists. And the idea here is to not look at just what people would know about from being in the press, which of course is very much how people get their impressions, but to look behind the research. So what I'll do in a minute is I will invite our 3 panelists to introduce themselves. And then when they've done that, I will invite them each to make their opening statement. So 3 minutes when they get to say whatever they want to say about the topic. And once they've done that, we'll then invite you, the audience, to ask questions. So in fact, you might want to get your questions in early, and I will endeavour to incorporate your question in the ensuing debate. And you do that by using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado then, let's go and meet our panellists. And first of all, let's meet Andy. Andy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everybody. So I'm Dr. Andy Newton. I'm an associate professor in criminology and policing at Nottingham Trent University. And my interests link to crime in place and time. So I'm interested in the intersection of crime and people and the opportunities that affords for crime to occur.
Thank you very much indeed. And from the United Kingdom over to South Africa. And Greg, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Gregory Breetsker. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Geoinformatics and Meteorology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. I'm a bit of a self-taught criminologist. My background is in geoinformatics and GIS applied to crime. And my interests revolve mainly around the spatio-temporal patterning of crime, mainly focused on South Africa, but also to some extent in New Zealand, where I lived for a period of time.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. And finally, Nick. Nick, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nick Tilley. I work in the Jill Dundee Institute at University College London, and I've been involved in research about crime prevention and policing for a very long time. And what I'm going to be talking about today relates to a project I've been involved in. It's funded by the UKR, the Economic and Social Research Council, involving people at Leeds University and UCL.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so you know what happens now. We invite each of the panelists for 3 minutes, just for them to highlight what they see as the big issues about the topic. And don't forget, a copy of what they say, a blog, which I will write, will be available on the website tomorrow. So will a copy of this recording. So let's go back to Andy. Andy, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. So as a bit of a reflection, I think one of the major lessons from COVID-19 to think about is how it's impacted on opportunity factors for crime. So how might it have changed the spatial and temporal mobility patterns of people in general? In the short term, how might it have changed their lifestyles and their routines? How might it have kind of changed how offenders and victims converge? And how it might have changed what we call the capability of guardians to actually try and intervene in these opportunities. So if we think about offenders and their awareness space of what they know, do they have the same targets and opportunities that they had before COVID, during lockdown? Do the same conditions and factors are the same factors present in terms of changing or reducing or switching opportunities for crime? And there's a number of papers that have been produced actually, and it's quite hard to keep track of all these. Probably the biggest international study recently was 27 cities, 23 countries, and it said overall there was a 37% reduction in crime. But this changes quite a lot by crime type. The other paper that I want to pick up on was one by Langston et al. In 2021, and it's the colleagues at UCL at Leeds, and UCL that Nick might talk about, and that was that there's been quite a bit of variation in terms of where these reductions have happened. So they haven't happened all over the country. They tend to have concentrated in small spaces where there's nighttime economy, where there's shops, where there's transport. And here there's been concentrations of reduction. So for me, key lessons, we need to know more about mobility patterns in our urban areas in order to understand patterns of crime. And we need to think very carefully about the type of crime and the context where that is. So to give you a very quick example to think about pickpocketing. Okay, pickpocketing has certain conditions, lots of people together, congested spaces, some travelers not really aware where they're going, people are distracted. It's easy for offenders to evade detection. What happens when COVID happens and lockdown happens to these levels of pickpocketing? Because these similar opportunities don't sort of happen. So will we get more of a different type of theft, which is kind of snatch theft or assaults? There'll be fewer targets available. So what happens there because it's not so congested? I'm not talking about domestic violence. I'm not talking about cyber, and I'm not talking here about new types of crime that might emerge. So for example, bio assaults. So I'm focusing really here on just thinking about these simple types. So in terms of prevention, I really think it's told us more about this importance of these urban mobility patterns, the importance of understanding locally and being crime specific. The changes that have happened globally have varied. They've not been the same everywhere. Lockdown's not been the same. What's happened to police resources? What's happened to sort of the support mechanisms for victims and offenders? How has it changed the kind of ability for us to prevent crime? So that is my opening statement on this. Thank you.
Andy, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Just say to the audience, if you'd like to get your questions in early, use the question button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll endeavour to incorporate it in the discussion that follows. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Then over to Greg. Greg, your opening statement, please.
Hi, Martin. Yeah, my statement's perhaps more broader than Andy's, and from a South African perspective, I think what makes South Africa unique is it's an extremely high crime environment, right? So we recorded 2 million crimes in the recording year before COVID, notwithstanding underreporting in South Africa, which is estimated at around about 50%, depending on the type of crime. Crime stats that have been released quarterly since the pandemic obviously indicate a reduction in crime, albeit from a very high bar. In the 3 months, January to March this year, again, much like Andy said, there's variation in the types of crime. So for example, property crime decreased the most, followed by contact crime and other types. So there has been an initial dip, but there's been no sustained decreases. And in fact, there's been an uptick in crime to the extent that now, for example, murder rates are higher than they've ever been, certainly in the past 5 years in South Africa. So that's an area of concern. They're mostly aligned with lockdown levels. As the lockdowns are eased, crime generally increases. It's not surprising. I don't find much of the research, and I was actually part of the study that Andy mentioned of the 27 cities, really interesting. I mean, it makes sense to me for crime to, it's much like traffic accidents. Of course, they will go down because no one's on the road, right? So what I find interesting, and perhaps this is the geographer in me, is the spatial variability in where crime occurs. I reviewed a paper yesterday looking at 5 police precincts just north of Cape Town over the lockdown period, and 3 of the police precincts had crime increasing over the hard lockdown, increasing. And that for me is very interesting, understanding the reasons why that is the case. And the unforeseen consequences of the lockdown, at least in that one study, was that that area of South Africa is very popular with holidaymakers, and there are a lot of holiday homes there. And interprovincial travel was banned. So lots of these towns in the west coast of South Africa were very quiet because holidaymakers in Gauteng and in the central provinces of South Africa weren't traveling down, and offenders knew that they weren't traveling down. They would not be interrupted. The other unique aspect of South Africa is that we had a bizarre alcohol and smoking ban. We're currently in one now. Alcohol has been banned from yesterday for the next 2 weeks. This is the 4th ban that we've had over the last 15 months, totaling about 6 months in total. This has led to a raging trade in illicit trade in tobacco and alcohol. South Africa already has the world's biggest illicit trade in tobacco. The criminal networks in terms of alcohol were openly advertising their products on social media and WhatsApp, and delivering to your doorstep in most instances. I may or may not myself have partaken in this illicit trade, which is driven, and I guess being something that we know is happening in South Africa, but it spurred these networks on. So those are my initial insights into at least the South African experience.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. Really appreciate it. So let's go to Nick then. And Nick, your opening statement, please.
Hi there. Thanks for asking me. As I say, I'm speaking about a project, or using data from a project that's been funded for UCL and Leeds together. And what we've looked at is the relationship between observed patterns of crime post-COVID-19 and the expected pattern based on previous years' rates and the trends in them. So we've modeled the expected rate and compared it to the actual rate. There are sets of publications that people can download if they're interested. A COVID-19 and crime trends series and crime science too, and I can let people have the links to those if they want them in due course. They might find them interesting. As Andy said, COVID-19 crime trends, like most crime trends, are largely driven by changes in opportunity, by patterns of opportunity and changes in opportunity. And here are some examples of COVID-19 related crime falls. So social distancing made direct contact crimes such as personal robbery and theft from the person more difficult, and those have gone down very substantially. The closure of shops led to sharp falls in shop theft and in commercial robbery when those places had to shut. The growth in working hours of working from home led to distinctive daytime falls in forced entry domestic burglaries, which wasn't found for other kinds of burglaries. So there was a temporal drop, but a much more marked temporal drop for those kinds of burglaries. Lockdown massively reduced the supply of targets and offenders in town centres, and where the nightclub economy had previously thrived, leading to huge levels of reduction there, which weren't mirrored in other places where patterns of mobility weren't observed in the same way, something that Andy alluded to earlier. Reduced train travel led to steep, enormous drops in crimes at railway stations and on railway stations. Theft from the person, cycle theft, vehicle theft at stations in particular, dropped like a stone, but there were far fewer drops in other rail network property, particularly on lines and on beside tracks. There were also rises in some kinds of crimes, again reflecting changes in opportunity. So the supply of fake medical products has increased, and it followed the growth in demand for treatment and ignorance about the effectiveness of treatment. Increased home delivery led to increases in porch theft of goods that were left in porches when they were delivered from home. The hasty provision of furlough payments and business loans created all sorts of opportunities for white-collar crime involving fraudulent behaviour. Travel restrictions have increased the opportunities for profitable romance scams as the people engaged in the scams have managed to put off any potential meeting with the victim and have managed to milk them for money in the meantime. So those sorts of crimes seem to have increased as a consequence of COVID-19. The implications for crime prevention, I think, are in broad terms quite clear. Increasing, you would want to intensify crime prevention activity and improvements in security as rapidly as possible when changes occur, which are liable to increase particular new crime opportunities, or increase crime opportunities for particular kinds of offence. We can try and anticipate ways in which crime opportunities may inadvertently be produced and try and design them out. For example, through the furlough payments arrangements, or through the ways in which business loans were provided. It doesn't seem sensible to expect the police to be able to deal with these sorts of crimes, to prevent these sorts of crimes, because they happen too quickly, and many of them are not open to enforcement responses that are liable to be effective. Having said all of that, some of the sorts of measures that you might want to take have a very poor evidence base at the moment. And that goes in particular for cybercrime, where lots is done, but little is known about what's effective. The longer term trends in crime post-pandemic depend on longer-term changes in opportunity. So for some crimes where opportunity was only temporarily reduced, for example, theft from passengers at railway stations and shop theft, we can expect rates to revert back to the normal levels in due course as city centres begin to be used and as transport networks begin to be used. For other types of crime, for example, the reduction that I mentioned in daytime domestic burglaries by forced entry, the longer term effect really depends on whether there is a reversion to working in the office rather than working from home, or working in businesses rather than at home. To the extent to which working from home becomes a new normal, then we can expect the suppression of burglars in the daytime to be maintained. Cybercrime may have increased online activity and skills in online criminal behaviour, which might produce longer term effects. And of course, antisocial behaviour related crimes, which are a function of the measures that were put in place following COVID-19, will disappear as those sorts of regulations come to an end. And that's all I've got to say.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you for your insights. Okay, lots of questions come in. Don't forget to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to come to you. Andy, let me come to you first on this one, and it's from Steve Orand. And Stephen has asked the question about to what extent we can rely on police stats as a measure during the pandemic. Now, obviously, there's always a question mark about the extent to which official stats reflect crime rates. Have we got any reason to be more skeptical about these during the pandemic? I mean, or can we say that it's reasonable to rely on them in the same way we did before?
So I think there's two elements to this question, isn't there? The first is around overall how much we can rely on police crimes, and obviously on recorded crime from the police. And that we've known this for a long time about underreporting, but that's not the same. Burglary is reported because of insurance generally in a number of countries better than say violence. And the most recent, I think, violence sort of paper from that came out related to A&E data, actually on ambulance data, sorry, suggested about 1 in 10 violent records that are in the ambulance database are found in the police. So we know about the underreporting. The question is, has that changed during the pandemic? And so have we got any less confidence in this police recorded crime data? So, and I don't see obvious reasons for that. There may be issues around police resources and their ability to respond. There may be different pressures on the police. In some instances, the police will have actually, so in the UK, for example, ASBs increased because of the issuing of fines. So there may be some changes, but I don't think there's been a substantial fundamental change in police recording. There is also, depending on how spatially you look at that, there's a paper recently that says that if you look at stuff on a more kind of meso level, so on a broader level, that actual some of these inaccuracies are reduced. So I think when you look at very fine street levels, there might be some issues, but on a broader level, I think I can't think of any reasons why, at least in the UK, that the police recording will have suddenly changed. I don't think the HMIC reports have reflected any of that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I mean, Greg, if I can just put the same question to you, just so we get another perspective on this. I mean, it all starts from this. One of the issues that has cropped up on a previous webinar where we've been discussing this is that for people out there is just how reasonable is it to rely on the data that's cropping up in a time where there's a crisis, when police themselves are off sick with COVID, when resources are stretched, when it's changing so much. I mean, is there any danger that in relying on this, one can seem to be partial, unscientific, not comprehensive enough, or just that's the best we've got and we better make do with it? Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head at the end. I think that's the best that you've got, and you've got to use what you have. I mean, the evidence in South Africa, if you compare the last 2 victims of crime surveys, show a decreasing trust in the police in South Africa due to a range of issues largely related to police leadership being implicated in various corruption scandals. So I would imagine that if trust in the police has gone down pre-pandemic, it's likely to have increased even more so during the pandemic. There is also evidence in South Africa that, much like in the UK, police resources, which are much more limited than in the United Kingdom, have been redirected to enforcing the Disaster Management Act in South Africa, which has been in effect for the last 15 or 16 months. to the point where I was at a webinar a few weeks ago where one of the police commissioners proudly announced that they had charged over 450,000 people with contraventions of the Disaster Management Act, when everyone was saying, what about the other crimes? And he marked this as a measure of success. And in the discussion afterwards, he was absolutely hammered by the attendees as indicating a COVID success story for the police. If that's their measure of success, then we're in more trouble than I think. So yes, I think that certainly in South Africa, there's always mistrust. There's always issues not only with the magnitude of crime, but also the geographic capturing of it. It's also questionable at best. But again, you have to, as a spatial crime researcher, you have to use what you have and accept the faults, but still hopefully try and get some insight from what you analyze.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me ask you a related but slightly different take on this. When you were summarising what's been going on, it in a way sounded fascinating because it was almost as if it was predictable. That it's about opportunity. These were structural changes that were taking place. It was entirely logical that those crimes were going to behave in that way. First of all, is that a reasonable assessment? We could have predicted this just based on the sorts of observations you were made. And I suppose if that's the case, one might have expected criminologists to have been more prominent in the media as explainers of that. And yet that wasn't once again, really the way it happened. Nick, your thoughts?
When you talk to the general public about crime, they generally say, we knew that already. But if you ask them beforehand what they think, they tell you what they think, and it's very different from what research shows. So it's quite difficult to surprise people, because once you tell, I've talked to police officers about crime patterns, and if I tell them in advance what they are, they say, of course, we knew that already. If I ask them first what they think the crime patterns are, they're often mistaken. So my guess is that it sounds very logical after the event, but it's not necessarily the patterns that would have been predicted. I do think that the role of opportunity in generating crime patterns is perfectly obvious. I actually think the previous question was a good question about crime, about police recorded crime, because some crimes, for example, drugs crimes and weapons crimes have increased in the UK, largely because the police have had more time proactively to pursue drugs crimes and more actively to follow up leads in relation to weapons crimes. At least I think that's the case. So you've got some odd patterns there that reflect increases in police activity rather than decreases in police activity. So, for example, British Transport Police, in the UK, we have a special police service to deal with the rail network. They had far less volume crime, but that freed up time to pursue other sorts. So when you've got police-initiated records of crime, it's a bit different from police recording crimes that have been reported to them by the general public, and the patterns are not necessarily identical.
Nick, just don't want to follow up on this. I mean, perhaps perhaps you, more than most criminologists in the world, have had an influence on policy. And I wonder whether you feel as though criminologists have really got themselves in a way, with all the knowledge that exists, where they're influencing to the extent they could. Because one of the things that's cropped up in this on these webinars is people were crying out for information about what now, and yet there was a sense in which we don't know, it's all up in the air. And I just wondered whether you thought that criminologists have perhaps got a bigger role to play in being able to put some interpretation for the benefit of security practitioners around the world.
Massively, I think that's the case. One of the odd facts about crime is that go into a public bar and people know everything there is to know about crime. Ask a competent criminologist and they'll tell you what they don't know about crime. So I do think that we know quite a lot. We could contribute to public discussions about crime patterns and indeed to policy decisions about it, but we're confronted with a hugely popular set of notions about what's happening in crime, which don't necessarily accord well with what we know when we do systematic research about the sorts of things that generate crime patterns.
Yeah, I must say, actually, one of the things I do say myself is that one of the things about being a criminologist, of course, everyone in the world's a criminologist. They've got a view on crime. And okay, let's move on. My old friend Tariq Gafoor. I haven't seen Tariq for many, many years. Tariq, I hope you're well. One of the things that Andy, that Tariq is asking about, is about whether with these new types of crimes, the cyber and perhaps into broader areas of fraud as well, is a new approach needed in the way that both we record perhaps and the way we present it. And there's two parts to this. One is the sort of mechanical process of what we do, but I think there's another part to this, and that's about engaging meaningfully with different audiences, and whether there's a way of doing this better. Maybe that was behind Tariq's question as well. Andy, your thoughts on this? I mean, what if any changes do we need to make? And how might we go about it? Andy first.
Okay, a fairly difficult thing to think through. I guess one of the things about sort of cyber in the UK is that it's not dealt with by our sort of 43 police forces. It's dealt with on a national level by the kind of National Crime Agency, and actually, you know, sort of fraud in itself has got its own kind of mechanism for actually reporting. So actually, you could argue that local police forces don't necessarily know about levels of fraud because it's reported to a national body. I've also, to some extent, I'm thinking about what Nick said about the kind of the police proactive role, and then the kind of public reporting of incidents, and I guess the third is the kind of the victimization surveys, right? The surveys of businesses in terms of what levels they've received. So do we need to focus actually on our kind of on our reporting methods and our kind of victimization to kind of get a better picture and an understanding, and then how are the police going to be trained to understand those kind of issues? I think it's a really complex set of problems. And also, going back to the previous question, if we don't rely on police crime data for looking at COVID, one of the problems with victimization services is they've had less resources to capture underreporting as it was as well. So in the UK, we've got the Crime Survey for England and Wales. That's had less resource to carry out the normal number of surveys it does. So that's actually reduced in terms of our understanding as well. So just wanted to tie that back to the previous question. But I think, yeah, it's something that I think yes is probably the answer, but I don't really have more thoughts on how. But I do think working with the kind of victimization reporting levels might be one way of thinking about how that might pan out.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, if I could come to you, Greg. I mean, Tariq's a former sort of senior police officer here in the UK. I wonder whether, Greg, this issue about how we engage, it just strikes me that it's back to Nick's point just now about the enormous opportunity there is to make the knowledge available within the world of crime science and crime expertise available to different audiences. It sounds an obvious step to be making. And yet, you know, if you look at the security world, it doesn't engage meaningfully. I wonder whether you think that there's a route to doing that better. I mean, are there any headline issues where we could think about the way in which criminological knowledge, for want of better words, is made useful or made accessible to those who could perhaps use it on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, is the short answer. I think I've got two thoughts immediately that come to mind. Two words: social media. I have a son who's a teenager, and TikTok is old now. I only heard about it recently. I showed him the TikTok banner on Euros, and he was like, "Jeepers, TikTok." That sucked. So yesterday. So I think you have to engage in South Africa, from our perspective, with our communities and our high crime. You have to create awareness from that perspective through social media. The other thought that I had is today, our former president, Jacob Zuma, was sentenced to 15 months in prison. And in the last 20 minutes, my phone has beeped about 30 times with memes about him serving 15 months in prison. So within one day, the Twitter sphere in South Africa is going absolutely crazy about the sentence of his, which is obviously a big deal for our former president. who's blamed for a lot of the issues that we're currently dealing with. So I think maybe it's superficial, but I think if you want to get people engaged with crime in their communities, that's one avenue that I think in a developing context, everyone has a mobile phone. Internet access is not complete in South Africa by all means, especially in rural areas. But network coverage is pretty much 100%. And I think any kind of engagement with companies that are able to disseminate daily crime reports or incidences would be of value. I know there are a number of initiatives in South Africa that are looking at that, but it gets complicated when you have to drill down to police precinct level and engage with the police in order to disseminate this information. If you're talking about scientific scholarly productions of crime science research and how like a nugget of a paper gets sent out to a broader community, there's been people talking about this forever. I think most universities are, Andy would say, Andy, yes, your research and your papers are great, but you got to, people must know, get your work out there. And this is an issue in academia in general. And to the point that we now have to send out tweets and Instagram posts for our research and summarize our research in a one-liner to someone in our university who then sends out a tweet. And I think maybe it's a silly way, but I think in South Africa, that's a way that you can get the biggest distribution of information in the cheapest, shortest way.
Yeah, interesting. Almost the counterintuitive for academia, which is used to explanations and detail. And
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Nick, Leander Fernandez has asked a number of questions, but running through these, Nick, is what next? Now, in some ways, you presented in your opening statement a whole sets of things about opportunities. And I guess why it's tempting for you to be able to say, I'm sure, well, what happens next depending on what changes take place. But is there a methodology? Is there a way in which we can guide the sort of security world and all those who are working in it about how to think about how they might behave with what next? On a structural level. Nick?
It's difficult. I mean, one of my colleagues, Shane Johnson, has the Dawes Centre for Future Crime, and that's an academic outfit which is devoted to trying to anticipate what kinds of crime opportunities are around the corner and how those crime opportunities might be stemmed. They do things like horizon scanning. They're in touch with technology companies, and they're in touch with developments across the waterfront of different kinds of science. The effects of COVID-19 will be one factor in shaping future crime, but it's not the only factor. New technological developments, in particular, I think in the cyber field and in bioengineering fields, are likely to create a host of new sets of opportunities. And I would guess that the security world needs to try and get a handle around what those things are going to look like in order to try and figure out how they can be best designed out. My concern, I think, throughout is that crime opportunities are generally produced inadvertently by people who are producing excellent developments for other sorts of purposes, but the side effect is often to create fresh opportunities, and trying to anticipate what those fresh opportunities are when you develop a new kind of technology, be it within the bio world or be it within the cyber world, strikes me as being very important. When you develop new kinds of taxation arrangements, when you provide new kinds of benefits, thinking through how those might generate new changed opportunities strikes me as being an important intellectual task, and the security folk might sometimes play a role in that, but not always, because that's in a way of trying to preempt the need for having security measures bolted on after the event when you've not managed to preempt the opportunities as well as you might had you put more thought in at the stage at which these sorts of developments were being conceived. I'm not sure that's a very good answer, but that's the best I can do.
No, I think it is helpful, and I think herein rests the challenge. I mean, I've been looking forward to doing this webinar precisely because we've been building up to it for quite a while. Andy, let me come to you next. And Simon Chan has asked a number of questions, but one of, I think, the crucial issues he's raising is, has the pandemic taught us anything more about the skill sets we need going forward to be better at understanding crime and or responding to it? In other words, we've had this big change. Things happened that are different. What do we know now, Andy, if anything, that could help us think through how we might do it better going forward? I mean, one of the points about these thought leadership webinars, it's 45 minutes. We don't try and solve the world problems, of course. We merely try to give ideas and thoughts about how we might look at it differently. Andy, your thoughts?
So I think one of the things that the pandemic's forced people to do is to start to share data again a little bit between organizations. And not necessarily worry so much about the quality, and not necessarily worry so much about, I mean, obviously there's data protection and GDPR and those type of issues, but actually I think we had a point where we kind of developed a lot of community safety work through community safety partnerships. And then I think austerity moved people back to siloed work a little bit. And I think one of the things that has possibly started to happen as a result is people have had to share data quite quickly to try and find out answers, and that hasn't happened across the field. But actually, we can't solve these problems on our own. You know, we really can't. And so actually, one of the lessons this might go back to is actually to get some better answers in terms of thinking, and Nick kind of alludes to this, we need to sort of go back to think offender, think opportunity. In order to understand some of this, we really start to need to share local data, local problems, in order to kind of understand the problem a bit more holistically. And I think one thing the pandemic might have taught us is actually that we can't go back to working in silos, because it really won't. And actually, you know, there's examples, I think, where it has caused problems, where people have worked in silos, or they try to tackle things on their own really quickly. I think domestic abuse is one real good example of that.
Yeah, really good point, actually. That's cropped up in a few previous webinars, actually, when we've looked at some of the benefits, Andy, and some of the points made is it's forced collaboration, because people were interested in collaborating over the pandemic, and the hope is that can breed new opportunities going forward. I think that's a good point. Greg, same question to you. Learning points about what we might take away as opportunities either to better understand what the problem is or respond more appropriately. Greg?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one in a South African context. I mean, we have, as I said in my opening statement, a very high crime environment. The opportunities that exist, I would argue, are secondfold in South Africa, because a lot of our crime is driven by socioeconomic need, right? When you have 30% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, 50% of people aged 15 to 34 do not have a job, that introduces a different dynamic. So when we talk about opportunity, there's one such thing, getting opportunity, pickpocketing. There's another opportunity where the environment to a large extent doesn't really matter when you are desperate. The opportunity, the risk, but desperation counts for a lot, and oftentimes rational thinking goes out of the window. I don't know if the future in South Africa is rosy in this regard, simply because the underlying causes of South Africa's crime problems, and I would argue most countries, have been exacerbated under this pandemic and not being alleviated. And I think particularly in a developing context, you're most likely to experience an increase in crime, certainly driven by need, economic need, and at a worst case scenario, unrest, civil unrest and social unrest, just driven out of desperation. That's kind of going off on a tangent on what the question was, but I think from a South African perspective, it is a concern, because I think that we are to some extent on the precipice when you have unemployment as it is, world's biggest inequality, and you've got a whole lot of people with nothing to lose and a whole lot of people with everything to lose in the same country, and that changes opportunity structures for me.
Yeah, it is an interesting point, actually. And maybe I'm going to, Nick, ask you the final question, if I might, from Keith Neal's side, just try to get it in. Because you've made the point, and it's in the question, that things have changed dramatically during the pandemic. And the question is about, what will happen next. But why don't I can ask you this question, Nick? If we go back to life as it was before, would you expect that crime would return to what it was? Or would that be a reasonable expectation, all other things being equal? Or is there some way in which, because we've been through all this, we're either wiser or more astute, or that we wouldn't expect that? I wonder, it's difficult. Maybe it isn't a difficult question. Let me pose it to you and see what you say in response.
I mean, my hunch, for what it's worth, is that if the opportunities revert to the levels that we had pre-pandemic, the crime levels are likely to go back to those levels too. So I think it really depends on what happens to patterns of opportunity post-pandemic. The only exception to that is that there may have been a disruption in the recruitment of new offenders into criminality that's been a consequence of lockdown. There are crucial times in young people's lives when they form peer group relationships, some of which are delinquent. If that peer group generation of criminality has been somehow disrupted by COVID-19, then we might see a longer term effect in terms of youth criminality. But I've got no idea whether that's the case or not. We think that might have happened in relation to improvements in car security, where the improvements in car security meant that the route into criminality was inhibited by the difficulty there is now in committing car crime. And the same might be true of the difficulty in being inducted into traditional high volume crimes during the pandemic.
Good. I'm pleased I asked you the question now. That was an interesting response. I hadn't really thought of it like that. And of course, if that's the case, then Nick, that's a positive. Of course, it's quite a big deal. It's not easily measurable, but the potential for that is quite a big deal. Okay, we've got. I just got one final question. Just 15 seconds each of you, if you wouldn't mind. A massive question. I'll start with you, Andy. Okay, next steps. As criminologists, what should the main focus be in terms of thinking about crime prevention? So you've got 15 seconds, Andy. Headline issue. What would you like to put out there? By the way, when I spoke to Victoria Wang from Portsmouth University on this about 3 months ago, she said, "Fund my research." So you're not allowed to say that. Andy, your comments first.
Okay. Opportunity, local context, urban areas understanding mobility patterns, and I think I'll go to Nick and problem solving. Okay,
thank you very much indeed. Greg.
Yeah, I would pretty much echo what Andy said, and from a South African perspective, the police need to gain a measure of trust from the community, and without that, I don't see anything changing.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Nick.
I don't disagree with what Greg and Andy said. I'd say, though, that we do well to figure out what works in reducing cybercrime in particular. So we've got a better evidence base for dealing with that, which is where crime's been going significantly in the past few years.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Panel, thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, audience, for the questions. Sorry we didn't get to everyone. It was a bit, there are a lot of them, but we'll return to this in due course. And many of the issues emerged from previous webinars, and I think they're going to crop up again. Thank you very much indeed. A few final comments from me, if I might, just to say your chance to contribute to a major survey, which closes on Friday, on the barriers to the potential mandatory reporting of fraud. Is it a good idea or not? If you've got thoughts on that, you've got till Friday to give us your thoughts, and we'd welcome them. Just to let you know that OSPA entries close in the United States on the 1st of July, in Benelux on the 4th of July, in Kenya on the 9th of July, Germany, Norway, and Romania. You've still got a bit more time. The Tackle Economic Crime Awards. For those of you involved in the world of economic crime, these are open at the moment. Do get your entries in. They'll close soon. And just let you know, the Cyber OSPAS, cybersecurity is a big issue worldwide. All the leading associations in the world are on message and on board this initiative to recognise those who are spearheading good practice that we may learn from and emulate. They're the categories. Do please spread the word about the Cyber OSPAS. And finally to say, we'll be going through it all again tomorrow. Now, normally it's Tuesday and Thursday. This week is a bit of an exception where we're going to be doing it tomorrow when we're in West Africa. And the title is about how the pandemic has produced a new type of security. Has it, or are things just the same? And we'll be debating that with 3 West African panelists tomorrow on the unusual day, Wednesday, a usual time of 4 o'clock. And wait for this, straight after that, we will be presenting the Nigerian OSPAS. So do join us for that. And by the way, next week we go to, for the month of July and August, we're going to Thursdays. I'm away and my colleague, Dr. Janice Goldsborough-White, will be chairing the session on Is Fraud Purely an Opportunistic Crime? That's her topic. She's an expert in that, and I look forward to listening to that in due course. So thank you very much indeed once again to the panel. Thank you very much indeed once again to all of you. I do hope that you can join us tomorrow at 4 o'clock. But until we meet again, wherever you are in the world, stay safe.